My name is Daniel Wright. I'm here at UNLV. Um, I'm in the College of Education in Educational Psychology and Higher Ed, and I'm the Dunn Family Foundation Endowed Chair of Assessment. So I'd like to thank the Dunn Family Foundation, and I'd also like to thank all of you for being here. We're going to be talking about data, and I know that's an exciting thing to talk about any day, but taking time away from busy afternoons I know is always tricky for stuff. One thing just to remind all of you, this is being recorded. So that means two things. If you say something and we talk about it at some point, that's being recorded, so be aware of that. And also that means that if there's stuff that you want to be reminded of later, then we can tell you at those points. Okay, let me carefully use my mouse. The first question is being data-driven good? And we've all sat in situations where people come into a meeting and say, of course, we're making good decisions because we're using data. Or if we think about the TV film with the Las Vegas A's, where they were able to show how using good data was able to help them win lots of games, it would seem like being data-driven is a good thing. It's certainly a mantra that shows up in lots of places. So I want all of you to think an answer to this question, yes or no. Is being data-driven good? Answer no, it's horrible. It's a horrible thing. What we're going to talk about today is some of the reasons why it doesn't work out, where problems can arise. But there's 3 dots there at the end, meaning there's a little bit of a caveat. That caveat is it's better than the alternatives that we have. So here's a book from over 50 years ago by Paul Mell, and he describes the difference between clinical, or basically humans making decisions, versus using simple statistical prediction rules. And he finds across all the areas that he looked at that statistical predictions, even simple ones, perform better than humans. So this is showing that if we use data and we use it wisely, we can be doing better than basing things just on our gut instincts or asking a bunch of people to try to come up with an idea. What I want to really stress, though, in this talk is not that being data-driven is good, but that how we do it's important. So that we need to make sure that we do it wisely, that we need to make sure we choose the right data, and that we turn that data into information wisely. We communicate it to other people in a good sorts of way. So what I'm going to be talking about is the data pipeline. And I'm going to try to control what I'm sending here. I'm going to put an I was going to put a sort of handout. We're going to sort out how to get all of you the handout for this at some point during the next hour. But what I'm going to talk about is the data pipeline, and it basically discusses how to get from data to a way to make wise decisions. Data are turned into information or knowledge, and this leads to us making wise choices in our decisions. This doesn't mean the right choice, just as in a gambler using all the right techniques over on the strip may not be able to correctly bet on every single sports game, but they will be able to choose what in the long run will be able to be better for their pocketbook than if they use poor methods. So we've got lots of data out there in education now. We have more data than we know what to do with. So we have more data than information. That's one of the issues that's really important to stress. And how we turn that data into information can be tricky. So I've got a quote here from the first set of Star Wars films, that prequel trilogy, where Dex Jetzer is talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi. I think that you Jedi would have more respect for the difference between knowledge and wisdom. So that then is the steps going from some bits of information to making these wise decisions. Let's look at a picture for this. So here is the data pipeline. If you begin with poor quality data, no matter what you do, you're going to end up with untrustworthy information. So there's an adage in computer science, garbage in, garbage out, or GIGO, and this is basically that. If you start with poor data, you're going to end up with untrustworthy information, and this will lead to poor decision processes in the long run. But if you start with high quality data, and we'll talk a bit about what high quality data means, you can end up with trustworthy information, but it will still be imprecise. So that's an important point to stress, that the information that we have within the world of education is not going to tell us exact values for what we really want to know, but it will give us some sort of idea, and this will help us make wise decisions if we use that information correctly. This can go wrong, though, if you have poor communication processes. You can then lead to poor decision making if the people who are making those decisions don't know what that information is. So if you've conveyed it to them inaccurately or imprecisely or with misleading parts or without stressing what the important aspects of the information are, then this won't put them in a good position to make proper decisions. You can also have high quality data and use incorrect statistics, and this can lead to untrustworthy information. So your statistics, you can choose the wrong ones. And this, I don't just mean pressing the wrong button in Excel and getting some number out that isn't right. I mean, different statisticians will argue about which methods to use, and sometimes they also will come up with information that's not good for making decisions. Here's a quote by John Tukey, one of the top statisticians from last century. And what he's really stressing here is that even if you have lots of data, this doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to get an answer from that no matter what you do. So it's important that you think about what the data are like and how you get from the data to the information to the decisions. And we'll be talking about some of the ways in which things can go wrong within that data pipeline today. Okay, let me carefully use my finger for this. Before we get on to that, though, I think it's important to stress a couple of things. The first thing is, should we measure these sorts of things that we tend to measure in education? I have a quote here from Jude Krishnamurti, and he describes how one of the problems in education is by doing all these measurements, it emphasizes the differences, and emphasizing the differences can create problems. So we have within education and within statistics more broadly, statistics is really the discipline that allows us to measure differences between all sorts of things. And this includes differences between students, differences between teachers, between schools. And the question is, should we be doing that? And the argument usually is, yes, we should be doing it so we can push training in certain ways that we want to push training, push development, push government money in certain ways. But we need to think about how we're doing that. We need to think about if we're doing that too much. We need to think about if we're doing that in the right sorts of ways. So he won't be arguing against things like taking somebody's temperature to see if they're sick. And so the question is, which things are important to measure? What we don't want to take from that is that any sort of number is a bad thing to apply to somebody. But we also don't want to make people think that a number completely describes somebody. So the start of the UK TV show, The Prisoner, this is an old show showing my age here. It starts with number 6, screaming out, "I'm not a number, I'm a free man." And one thing, having a number attributed to you does not make you either not free or make you any less human. So I give an example here, second one using Star Wars today, where the Jedi Master measures Anakin Skywalker's midichlorian levels and finds them to be over 20,000. And by measuring this number, assigning this number to this individual, it actually helped Anakin to become a free man. Okay, there's some issues with this example. There were some negative consequences of him beginning to do his training to become a Jedi, but it shows that having that number assigned to you can in fact make you a free man. And I sort of mentioned before with the temperature. So we've all had over the last year and a half walking into a lot of buildings and having our temperature taken, providing it's in the level somewhere around 98 or so. That kind of reconfirms, puts further evidence towards us being actual human beings. So again, that number is useful, but that number doesn't describe in any large capacity what we're like. It's about one particular attribute. And we have to remember that we shouldn't let numbers really take over too much meaning. We shouldn't let numbers become more valuable than what they're intended to be. I should also stress that I'm assuming that the data that we get in is not bad data, or what's called nowadays fake news and various things. And we would hope that would be true in education, but it's not. So we know on tests, sometimes you get test scores that come in that really don't look accurate in any sorts of ways. That could be cheating, that could be data entry errors at various points. So you get in lots of the cartoons and stuff, or the sitcoms where some bright child has accidentally put all their little scribbles in those little bubbles 1 point away from the other. So you get things like that, which can come in where you know the data just are not accurately measuring that attribute at all. And so those are things that we need to look out for. And that's particularly true when we think about how people look at social media and stuff. But I'm not going to talk too much about that today. One thing that is important is how we select the data. So we know that the data that we decide to measure, that's a decision that's been made, and that has a lot of consequences. So how do we decide what should be measured? It should be considered for that. It should be considered if we're asking the right questions. And I don't mean questions just on an assessment, but the right questions more broadly about why we want to have those particular measurements, and think whether those particular data are the right ones to address that question. So those are kind of steps before we get to the entire data pipeline. So we're assuming that the data are the right sorts of data and they're not completely fake. So one question is, why not just use perfect data? So perfect data doesn't exist in any education place, perhaps with the exception of here, I've got the Hogwarts emblem. Maybe at Hogwarts, they do have perfect data somehow. So perhaps the sorting hat does magically classify people into the right of those 4 quadrants there. But Hogwarts isn't real. I hate to tell people. So we don't have any place with real data there. That's the motto, never tickle a sleeping dragon. So just for Hogwarts fans who haven't translated that before or don't know its origin, I'm assuming Rowling took that from Feynman, who described that when they were in the Manhattan Project, seeing how much uranium they could use before it blew up everything. So a rather dangerous set of experiments back then, and Richard Feynman described that as tickling the sleeping dragon. Okay, so a brief overview of where we're going to go over the next 45 minutes or so. Already mentioned a bit about where the data are from. So think about that. Think about, are these going to be good data? Are these going to be useful? Evaluating the actual data. And the 3 ways in which we evaluate those is usually the reliability, validity, and fairness of the data. And I'll talk a little bit about what each of those mean. And it's important to stress that those are the 3 pillars of measurement that get talked about by the education and the psychological groups when they talk about measurement, how these are the things that we want to make sure that we measure when we're measuring attributes about humans or about any sort of topic. We want to make sure the measurement is reliable, in that we get the same sorts of values each time we do it, valid, that it gives the measure that it's supposed to, and fair, that it measures different groups of people at about the same fairness. We'll talk about doing the appropriate analyses. I'll give a couple of examples where the statistics that were done within an education setting were not very good. And I'll end with how to communicate the story well. And I'll give examples where we can show how to not communicate it well, because that unfortunately is often more common than communicating things well. My finger is too strong, I think, for pressing the buttons. Okay, let's start with data. Data exists in lots of places within education. So these are all related to some sort of educational assessment, and most of my work is in the assessment tool. So that's where I'll be drawing most of the examples from. And we see just some examples here, the map suite that gets used at CCSD and a number of other places. Smarter Balance, a consortium of states, including Nevada, used that for some official assessments. We know the SAT, ACT, and the lots of discussions that have been going on about those over the, well, for a long, long time, but really a lot over the last year or so, particularly with the state of California, University of California, talking about trying to build their own and how that may look. So there's a lot on assessment there, but there's also lots and lots of other education data. So if we talk to the policy people, they'll be talking about all sorts of other data, including financial data. But we know when you talk to people dealing with lots of things within any educational system, there's so much other data related to all the things like from food to salaries to buildings to lots and lots of things. And even things like, how the different sports are doing and stuff. There's a lot of data related to that. So there's lots of different data that exist in education, and the issues that I'll be talking about apply to all of those. Okay, let's begin though with the reliability of data. The general definition of reliability is if somebody took a test twice, would they get similar scores? So if I took a Geometry 1 test today and took the exact same test tomorrow, being in the exact same state I am today, so without the extra practice, would I be able to get about the same score? Would the test give me the same score? That's a situation that we can't create, because once you take the test, you've taken the test and you presumably have learned from it. But we have various methods to get out estimates of how reliable the test would be. And these methods are done by all the big testing companies. So they come up and make sure that the tests they're showing are fairly reliable. So you should be getting, if you get a score in this sort of range, say a 32 to 34 on the ACT, your expectation would be that you'd be in that sort of range the next time, maybe a couple of points higher, a couple of points lower, unless there was something like you had the flu on one test. So we sort of know their situations on that. A very useful thing that a lot of the testing companies do when they have an assessment is they create plots like this. And this plot shows for their estimate of the person's ability, the probability of getting different questions correct. So if we look at the dark blue line, people who have lower ability, so down at -2, and I should say the testing companies don't use negative numbers when they tell people their scores, but the statisticians tend to when they're doing the modeling, because it works. It's easier for us to see 0 as the median, but you don't want to tell a child they have a negative score on anything. So you scale it so they start with a much higher score. But people who are scoring down in the bottom 5 or 6%, which is around the -2 area on this plot, would have a very low probability of getting that blue item right, whereas kids at the top would have a much higher probability, and that probability increases as we move through the plot. This compares to the light green line, where all the kids have about the same probability of getting it right, and it doesn't increase much. So it's really not measuring ability very well. You sometimes get trick questions where you might have somebody who has a really, really great knowledge about it, gets it right, but so your A+ students get it right, but your A-, B+, B- students get it wrong because they didn't figure out your little trick, and the C and D students get it right because that seemed the more obvious one for them. We want to avoid those trick questions. And those are things that when you're writing your own assessments, it's worth checking for. So here's my main advice with your own assessment. So sometimes you'll get assessments and you'll get back some plots like this or something that gives you this information. But an easier thing to do is just to look at the kids who get a question right. Do they tend to get all the other questions right also? Or are there questions where kids who get it right tend to get more of the questions wrong, but the kids who get it wrong tend to do better? So those are the sorts of things to look for once you have your data. But of course, it's better not to have those sorts of questions in any assessment that you're doing, but it's better to check afterwards rather than just leaving them in, because those are not going to be useful for trying to get good measures of ability. And so what often people do is when they get those questions, they just say, okay, it wasn't a good question, just going to count it right for everyone for that. So this relates also to how we measure the uncertainty in the estimates for each individual. So the confidence intervals, and I'm not going to get into any statistics this talk other than just a conceptual thing for what the confidence or the plus or minus thing that exists at the end of, sorry, my finger is slow on that, but here's these people with a little bit of color added. The plus or minus thing that you read in the newspapers where people say that the percentage of people who agree with the commissioner's thing last night is 63 plus or minus 4% of the people. That 4% tells you that the 63% estimate from whatever survey that was done, it thinks it's really somewhere in that range from 59 to 67. You won't bet your house that it was exactly 63, but you'd be more confident it was in that sort of region from 59 to 67, assuming the other aspects of what they did were correct. It's got a more specific meaning, this confidence interval, and that is if you repeat the procedure over and over, about 95% of the time, the true value would be within the interval found on each replication. Now, I read that, and normally you shouldn't read slides because all of you can read those just as easily, but I read that just because it's a very specific, weird sounding definition of something, and you'd rather have it be something like, there's a 95% chance that it's in that interval. It doesn't quite mean that. And that's true with a lot of the statistics that people report. You tend to get simplified descriptions of it in newspapers. And so it's important just to be careful with those sorts of things. I should say this is the person on the far left is Ron Fisher. So he's really is the founding father of computational statistics. He's the F in Fisher, if you've done statistics, is the F value in ANOVA. So that was named after him, although he didn't want it to be named after him. He also has a rather checkered past doing things like he's smoking in this one, and he was paid by the smoking industry for research and reported that smoking is pretty good for you. Egon Pearson and Jerzy Neumann are two other people. These three people were all together in London for a while. Niemann and Fisher had a falling out, and Niemann then came to California and was at Berkeley for a while and really set the California statistics as a hub for what's going on. So with Cal and Stanford first, and also UCLA coming in there and a few others. So these are three of the more important people in the history of statistics. Okay, how is this important for what all of us do? Well, one example is personalized learning systems. And these are where you might read information from some sort of module for an hour or two, then take a brief exam with it. And this is done with kids as young as in, second and third grades in some of these places. And then they take a 10-question quiz, and they're told if they get 8 out of 10 right, they can go on to the next level. The difficulty with this is these, with only 10 items, these have a really wide interval. So if you get 7 right or 70% right, it means your true knowledge is somewhere, you would give the estimate somewhere between 40% and 90%. So that really broad range. So what you're saying really is that there's not that much information in just that one quiz. And one of the arguments we've made to the personalized learning people is that because there's not that much information here, what you should do is first ask the student whether they think they've mastered it, because they may have a fairly good idea about how well they've done. Then use this as an extra thing, and then ask them again, providing they have they've done all right with it. Okay, briefly on validity. So reliability is about the variability in the estimate. Validity is about whether it's measuring what it's supposed to be measuring. And I'm just going to briefly mention this for academic tests. So one thing you often hear is that academic tests measure how good you are at doing tests, which is a circular sentence. And they do, but that's a combination of two things, some sort of academic ability and some sort of test-taking behavior, for example, time management. And what you need to do is somehow split these things apart. And the whole idea is that this particular method, test-taking, is stuck with test-taking ability, and those things like time management, as well as the ability, as well as the true academic ability. And I just have a quote here from a Fields medalist, which is the sort of Nobel Prize in mathematics. So this is a very, very bright person. He describes himself as always deeply uncertain about his own intellectual ability. He thought he was unintelligent. And it was true that I was and still am rather slow. I need time to seize things. Being quick or slow isn't really relevant. And he's describing this as somewhat in a book describing where he's talking about all the mathematical wonderful things that he had done throughout his life, but saying that time management speed wasn't really a factor with it. But speed for a lot of these tests does factor in. And that's true even for the tests which we don't put time limits on, because the kids still want to finish quickly and go out to recess for a lot of these things. They don't want to be the last one doing things. Okay, item fairness. This is where if you're trying to measure something and you have two groups that have about the same ability on it, you'd hope that the estimates of these abilities are similar. So innate intelligence, this is an old test. And so we can come up with really horrible examples with older tests, but with newer tests, we can come up with examples that just may not be quite as obvious. But here's one from an older test, innate intelligence. So this is what you're born with. What would you say is missing from here? Okay, so this may not be that innate. It may be if you spend a lot of time in a country club with a lot of tennis courts around, that you may be able to notice that there's no net there for the tennis players, but it's certainly not innate intelligence. And this is one of several examples that gets talked about as how a lot of the tests that have been created by particular social classes, or in the case of groups invading other countries, by those invading groups and then giving it to people describing scores that are low on these tests that were developed not with these people in mind, but developed from the perspective of the people coming in as deficits that people have. And so that's a really big issue. That's something that's been more in the spotlight over the last 10 years within the measurement world and the testing world. It's been talked about, though, by the testing companies for much longer than that. The best things that the testing companies, though, have as far as the statistical things is something called differential item functioning. And what that does is looks at individual items and tries to see whether those individual items seem out of place with the rest of the assessment when comparing different groups. I've underlined the word item there because they really address the item and not overall whether this entire assessment is unfair in certain ways. And that's something that is getting discussed a lot, for example, within the SAT, ACT discussions. Okay, so that's data. Data, we need to think, are the data the right data? Are the data accurate? But then also, are the data reliable? Are the data valid? Are the data fair? And the reliability, validity, and fairness are not yes or no things. Each of those is on some scale with it. So you can't have a perfectly reliable scale that will give you the same answers each time, but you can have ones that are better. So if I'm measuring height, it's going to be more reliable if I measure somebody's height every single morning for a year than if I measure something like their mood or their weight, for example. But then if you have good data, the next step is statistics, changing these into information. So here's a little test for all of you, multiple choice test. If you have good data, aren't statistics A, bland and boring? They're what we see on ESPN, and they talk about, a player's average for the softball Olympics or something like that. Or B, done by really bright people, so infallible, even though they may not be able to explain them. Or C, require often untestable assumptions, aren't agreed on by all statisticians, and stats folks are the most skeptical about what other statisticians tell them in various things, and statisticians like to disagree with other statisticians, and I could continue going on with other reasons that reinforce why C is really the right reason there. So statistics is a lively discipline. It's more than averages, and we can see that when we're listening to those commentators on sort of ESPN when they talk about all these new statistics in baseball and softball in particular that didn't exist. So I said 20 years ago, it didn't exist 5 years ago. They keep adding new ones each year. The second one is the most problematic of them, trusting that what you're getting is right. Statisticians differ both in their approaches, but also in how convincing they may be to tell you some sort of thing. And be wary if you have somebody who can't explain what they're doing. If they have difficulty explaining to you what method that they're using, that should get you worried. And we'll give some examples in the next 15 minutes or so about that. Okay, so here's an example from New Mexico, one of our neighbors. So like all the states, there's things about measuring the effectiveness of different schools, and lots of different things go into that overall effectiveness measure. So one of the things that goes in for high schools is the graduation rate, and also in most of the states, the change in the graduation rate, so the graduation growth rate. So you want to reward schools that have high graduation rates, but also reward those who are improving in various ways. So here's some data for some schools there. These are real data from real schools that I don't know, they're currently on their website, but they at least were last year on their website. So they're all publicly available. And we see the top group, they're schools that begin doing well and go down a little bit. So their graduation growth rates, they're going from 100 to 93 to 83. So going down a bit. The ones at the bottom, and these are just 8 schools out of tons, so I'm using these for example. The ones at the bottom start really low and go up a little bit, so 26 to 36 to 50. So for this particular way of measuring school effectiveness, they allowed 4 points for the graduation growth rate. So they had a whole nother set of points for how their overall graduation levels were going. But for the growth, they allowed 4 points. 4 points was good, 0 points was bad. And here's the scores that they gave. So what we can see is the top schools, which were all going down, got really, really high scores. The bottom 4 schools, which were going up mostly, got really, really low scores. So a fair number of those schools who were towards the bottom appealed, got those grades changed in a rather opaque sort of way so that they got higher scores with it. But clearly something was going wrong here in the way that the statistics were being used to calculate it. When we look at this, someone should be able to just say, let's just use a really simple method like subtract the 2014 to subtract the 2012 score from the 2014 score. And then you get a negative score for the first sets and positive scores for the next ones. And that shows you're going up or going down appropriately. But instead what they had was a fairly complex method sold to them. And I use sold there in quotes. But what happens with a lot of these things is people either hire in a statistical consultant or somebody who describes these things in ways that make it sound like they're going to work every time for them. And as shown here in this example, this does not work for them. So what they had done is they had chosen B over what could have been a much simpler and more transparent way of doing it. So in general, A is better than B, being bland and boring and making it obvious what's happening, because that means what you're doing will be transparent to your stakeholders. So what I was trying to tell them when I worked with them is that ideally, a principal should be able to, once they get some other information in from like the testing companies, they should have been able to calculate what their score would be without it even going through what we were doing there in the stats programs. So bland and boring, if it works, is better than overly complicated and ununderstandable. I should say, once we presented these things to the Secretary of State, she did change so that they were doing option A rather than option B. So just looking at the slope differences with there, but we sort of offered some other ways also that would work better. What ends up happening with that is the model that was used was overly complex and just it overfit the model so that it was a flip of the coin, basically, whether it worked or it didn't work. Okay, let me check time. We've got value-added models. I'm going to talk about this fairly briefly just because it gets talked about a lot. I'm assuming everybody on this call has some sort of view about value-added models, and that most of you have a negative view about them because that seems to be what, well, I'm sure if I surveyed people in CCSD and did a vote on it, more people would say negative things about it. There's a lot of aspects of it that you can be worried about. I'm only going to talk about what I can say I have some knowledge about, and that's the statistical aspects of whether it's measuring what it's supposed to measure, but with the one caveat that you should always worry if the thing that's being sold to you has the title of what you're supposed to conclude about it in it. So if you call something value added and you haven't shown that it's adding any value, you should be a little concerned as a consumer. Okay, so what do people think about value-added models? Here's what Braun said in 2018. People have magical thinking, that these are statistical incantations that can overcome all these serious threats to validity. So you press a magic wand against this magic hat, throw all these numbers in, and suddenly out comes this caterpillar plot, which shows all the different schools and the variability in those estimates, but those estimates actually convey something about the effectiveness of the school, the cause the school has on the students' test scores. And so this was something I described to a class one time, and they asked why it was called a caterpillar plot. And I said, well, because of the smoking caterpillar in Alice's Adventures. And what the Queen had said, why sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. So just a warning on giving what you think are obvious jokes in a talk. Apparently I don't use the right sort of tone to preface obvious jokes. That was a joke, but I got it back in some of the exam questions where people actually said that was why it's called that. It's called the caterpillar plot because it's supposed to look a little bit fuzzy as it goes along there, and sometimes it does, depending on how many schools you have in there. Okay, so the basic idea is people believe that you have a Harry Potter type character, or what statisticians like to dress up as when we do our magical things on the computer. We simply tap a few buttons and out magically comes these estimates of school effectiveness without any problems whatsoever. So let's look at reality outside of the Harry Potter world. Harvey Goldstein, one of my former teachers who sadly passed away this past year, he was one of the main people who really developed these sorts of methods. So he's in a better position than anyone else on the planet to describe how good or bad these are and whether they truly are a magic wand. And he says, certainly not a magic wand that will allow us automatically to make definitive pronouncements about differences between individual schools. So the magical thinking which Braun describes that some people have is not accurate. We can look at this in different sorts of ways. One is using simulations. So we can set up a situation where we think is in this case, a very simple sort of situation where we try to measure the effect of schools onto some sort of score after the student has taken part in enough of that school activity where the school can have some effect. And we can try to measure that and see how well the statistical models, the value-added models do to estimate that true effectiveness. We can simulate it so we will know what the true effectiveness is. Let me just walk you through what's here in this figure. So what we have is the pre and post scores that are only measured scores. We tend to have some covariates, some whole bunch of other variables that we can throw into the model if we'd like to. Some places do, some places don't. They give bizarre reasons for why they do or don't. I'm not going to go into that. I'm going to stick with the simplest models here. So we have those two, but we have a number of other things that we will not have measured. So we'll have aspects of the person, aspects of the family, all these other unknowns. And that will have some sort of effect on the post scores here. It will also have some sort of effect on the pre-score. So the scores taken before the student arrives at the school, ideally, or more regularly, the scores at the beginning of the school year or at the end of the previous school year. So this will affect that. And that could be how much pressure the kids have to do homework or genetic factors or all sorts of other things. There will also be a lot of school neighborhood effects. These will also affect the previous scores. Perhaps also through how they've affected previous school effectiveness through that. And these school neighborhood effects will also relate to how effective the school is. So we have these sorts of things going on. And the school effectiveness here in the red arrow is what we're trying to actually measure. And we can set how important school effectiveness on post scores is. And it's probably what goes on in a school is less important than all the other family things and all the person characteristics and stuff like that. But we can play around with these numbers. And the nice thing with the simulation is we can add all sorts of other numbers, or we can add more variables to things, and we can play around with it in lots of ways. I'm going to keep just with this really simple one here and carefully move that and run a quick simulation with it. So here we'll have a simulation, 100 schools, 100 students per school. Very simple situation, not even going to consider classroom effects, teachers effects, all these other ones. So you'd like to have any statistical model, if it works or doesn't work for a really simple situation, that's good evidence for how it may do with more complex ones. If it doesn't work for the simple situation, you're going to have big problems when you get more complexity coming in. So here's the line within the statistical language R, within the package LME4. You don't need to know this. I just wanted to show that the core of the simulation here and the actual thing that calculates what's called the conditional modes, which in this case is the school effectiveness scores. It's a complex looking thing, but it's a single line. So you have to do a lot of data prep for it and have to understand what it's doing. But that single line creates a measure for the value added scores for the individual schools. And what we can do is we can write a little function that compares these scores with the true scores, because this is a simulation, so we can actually look inside the simulation and see what the school effectiveness scores were. And we can see are the two correlated. So a correlation, most correlations go from -1 to +1, where -1 means is one value goes up, the other value goes down. Positive, one value goes up, the other value goes down. 0 means that knowing the value on one doesn't tell you anything about the value on the other. And usually people talk about a correlation of 0.5 being pretty high, correlation of 0.2 being smallish, correlation of a bit higher being, 0.6, 0.7 being a pretty high correlation. And negative correlations, again, meaning as one thing goes up, the other thing goes down. So what I want people to do is think what would be a good enough correlation between the estimates from this value-added model with, and I should say there's a few varieties of value-added models. This line up here would have been basically what was used, for example, in the New Mexico one. So it's what's used in a lot of them. You can build in lots of other things. You can build in multiple years. So with the New Mexico one, they had a few more years in there, but you can do different things with that. So here's a quick little snap of what's going on in R. I just put in those numbers that we had in the last plot, and let's see what the correlation is. It's negative. So we can play around with these numbers. We can discover why it's often negative and when it happens to be negative. And it actually, for that particular model, it shows up as negative for a large variety of numbers that look fairly realistic. So then when you go and show people this and say, here's what your value-added models are doing, here's why they're doing this, it's because this sort of thing, you need to figure out whether this model, this simulation, is an accurate description of what you're doing for that. And if not, you should be really concerned to make high-stakes decisions for that. I should add, the value-added models, particularly for teacher effectiveness, all the court cases that go on with that, just assume that they work pretty well, or they do ways that, they say, oh, the problems are when you have multiple teachers within the same classroom. Those extra complications add extra things to it, but the problem is much more basic than that. Okay, I should add, there's a mathematical explanation. I think simulation is better than mathematical jargon for trying to change any sort of policy for it. If you want to see me talk more about the importance of simulation within education policy, here's a YouTube channel for that. I'll have a sip of Dr. Pepper to give people who want to write that down time to write that down. But you can send me an email if you want that. Okay, the last part, if I can finish my sip of Dr. Pepper, is the appropriate ways to communicate information to other people. So here's a word that's an old SAT type word. So a word that in most places you wouldn't think gets used very often, obfuscate. So it's to make unclear, to make more obscure in some sort of way. And as you read things like computer manuals or some descriptions in different places or some policy documents, it appears that the users may have purposefully tried to make things sound a little bit confusing so that it wasn't transparent. And really, education policy on these sorts of things should be as transparent as possible because of all the different stakeholders that are going to be affected by it. Okay, so let's go back to New Mexico. I'd worked in New Mexico, lovely place, great place to visit. A few problems there with the school grading system, but they had their manual for that. They sent up to Los Alamos, or the folks in Los Alamos went and got it. It's 45 minutes from where the government seat is. So this is the people who, where they were tickling the sort of sleeping dragon. These are the rocket scientists. This is the city in the US with the highest per capita Ph.D. folks in it. And they couldn't figure out what the grading system was. And it wasn't because it was doing really overly complex things. It was because the descriptions just really weren't clear. The descriptions were contradictory on different pages for doing different things. They were saying different things, and they were really making it more difficult to figure out what was going on. So this would be a case where they weren't describing the information in a way that could make it of good use for the people to try to make good decisions on. Communication of information is something that statisticians really didn't focus on until the 1970s. Then there's a book called Exploratory Data Analysis. It's actually about 5 feet away from me on my bookshelf. Came out, and that really turned what was more of the idea of making really good plots was to try to hide information from people or to try to impress them in some sort of way. What Tukey did in 77 was really say, here's different methods to try to clarify data, to try to make things look better than they were. So we can have explanations and visualizations can be very useful to make things clearer to people, but they can also raise more questions than answers. Both of those can be good things, but one thing that you don't want it to do is to make people confident about an incorrect thing. You don't want to really clearly describe something that is an error. And so we see that with, for example, a lot of the discussion of vaccine things. If you think that what the CDC is saying is confusing, or that scientists say one thing one day, then they learn information from data the next day and they say something different, and that's really confusing. So you instead go for a really simple answer. That's not what you would want to do. But we have different groups of people who talk about the world in different ways. So artists, novelists, for this quiz would be wanting to make you think about reality more. So here's Escher on the right. This clearly isn't simplifying what's going on in reality, but it's making you question things about it. It makes you see more and expand more with it. Whereas if you're writing reports, or if you're a scientist writing some sort of description of your data, you really want to simplify it. So we use the word lots that you create models for things. Models are not the actual thing. A model airplane is not an airplane. It's a model of an airplane. It's a simplification of a complex object, but it takes on various attributes of the airplane that help us to describe certain things about it. So that's where it's useful for it. I'm going to end now just talking about making a plot. This is one I first used a long time ago at the Higher Education Academy. That I was talking with them, but it was a lot the Psychology Network. So we use this description of data, trying to show a clear sort of way to describe where psychologists are going. So we can see in this bar chart that we've got the percentages going up as you move further down, except for other at the bottom where you have a whole mishmash of different things. So it's a fairly clear plot. But with modern technology, we can now make it much more confusing. And so this means, this is one of the problems with technology. It allows us to use, if there's a bizarre button that allows you to do some sort of complex looking thing to a plot, a third grader is going to press that button to see what it looks like. And it may not help to make the data that you're trying to describe clearer, or trying to make it more accurate, or trying to make the story that you're telling more accurate to people. So we took this plot and we thought, how can we use technology to make it worse? So here we go. This now has, the most obvious thing is that there's some sort of visual illusion that's taking place there in the actual bars. I've also put the names in a bad font, but so it's darker, it's more difficult to read. But I put them in alphabetical order just to show the reader that I know the alphabet, because I think that'll be really important for them to know about it, about me. I've added 0.00 at the end of all those numbers. There's a popular statistics package that does that. The only reason is to use more ink for it. So adding those 0.00s and at the problem with, well, and it just clutters it. And then also I decided I should let my cat do something for it. So that's where the X value that label is from. So I thought, oh, that'll be good. Let my cat take part in the paper, allow the cat to be an author on there, and you can see how excited the cat was. So I sent this off to a journal, and the article was about making bad plots, or making bad all sorts of things. And so it was clear to them that I was doing this on purpose to make things really bad. So what did they do? They added this red and green. So that kind of changes the visual illusion a bit. It does add to it that you have a lot of people who would have difficulty differentiating that. So we know it's worthwhile, and for people who are doing government policy, you'll be putting your things through various checkers to see how it looks for people with different types of color blindness, but this will be how that plot is viewable for people with red blind protanopia. What else have they done? They've kept that 0.00. They turned percentage into percentage. I'm just baffled by this, how they saw just horrible plots throughout this paper, and they thought that was a spelling error. And of course, that meant that I had to take somebody off the author list for it. Okay. Only good thing about it, though, is they did at least write all these things so small so people couldn't be able to see what they were doing. That's one thing that you see in a lot of plots. People write really, really small as if that's appropriate. It's not. Okay, let's make this even worse. Pie charts tend to be worse than bar charts. It's more difficult to differentiate angles than to differentiate heights. I'm looking at the clock, so I'm going to go more quickly through it. So what we can do is we can press that button and make it into a 3D bar chart. So now this is a plot that would be really difficult to try to understand if this was presented to people. Here's what Leland Wilkinson says about 3D pie charts. They incorporate nearly every visual illusion discussed in this chapter. And it won't surprise people, probably that's in a statistics manual, the SysStat manual. And I made all these plots in SysStat. So despite it incorporating every visual illusion discussed in this chapter, it also allows you to make it. Okay, so this seems about as bad as anybody could make a plot. So I go off to the Higher Education Authority and see their poster up and look at the lower corner of it. And they've even done it worse though. So they've separated out those different pies. So now trying to figure out the pies, which is already tougher, as we know when we're trying to decide who gets which particular slice of cake at different parties, splitting them up now makes it even more tricky. So this looks about as bad a plot as one could get. So we tick the sort of button to see where they reported these data on their website, and that's what they've got. So an incredibly horrible plot where you have to then go and look at the next page to see what these different things are. You can't really see what's going on in the different things. I get people saying, oh, but they put those percentages there, so at least those are there. Well, yeah, you can just put those in a table. So what they've done here is probably had somebody spend several hours making this atrocity, making this horrible thing, and they thought they were doing something useful instead of just trying to confuse anybody who saw it. I guess they were doing something useful. I've been using this plot for several talks just as a demonstration. Okay, so let me finish there. Two main things to really get at from this. So there's the data pipeline, how to get from data to making wise decisions. But it's important to be skeptical both about the data and the resulting conclusions. Understand how people went along the data pipeline to get to where they made those decisions. Ask about how the data were chosen. Ask about how the conclusions were reached for that. Okay, I'm going to finish there. So I'll just show the Sertuki book, just to show I wasn't lying. But hopefully your first thought wasn't he's lying about having books in his office. So